Hey One Hope, as we promised, we wanted to kind of give you a fuller version of our story. And so on Sunday, a couple of weeks ago, we told you some of the bare bones and just how God is on a big mission and how we're all part of that mission, and He's ascending God and we're a going people and all of those things. But we did feel like it would be really great to deep dive a little into some of the detail of our story and just how God has led us over the years. And it's been quite a substantial journey, even as we've just prepared for this and writing it down, just seeing the faithfulness of God in leading us. And so we just want to share the story with you whenever you are watching this.
So, well, our story began, Paul's sort of began a little bit more before mine, but our story really began in 1982 when I was born in the UK. And I was born, raised, loved the UK, thought I might take a little bit time out of education after my A-levels and came to South Africa, which I did feel very prompted to do. But anyway, more of that another time. Met Paul. I fell in love with South Africa and then Paul.
No, other way around.
No,
other way around.
I loved country first. And we got married and after a brief period in the UK for me to finish my degree, we moved back to South Africa and settled here. I never wanted to leave the UK, but it wasn't that I didn't want to live in South Africa, but I lived with this love for these two places, and the homesickness was sometimes quite difficult to live with. And I'd asked the Lord many times over to take away the longing for the UK. But He didn't, and at times it felt like it was a character flaw. But I think over the years we actually came to see it as something maybe God had left in me for a reason.
Yeah. So we processed that many times as a couple over the years, and began to feel like God was in it, and it wasn't just some negative emotion that we needed to overcome, as much as feeling like God had left it in Kate, and then God slowly began to awaken in me a certainty or a desire. I'm not quite sure what the best word is, but we began to talk as a couple about feeling that one day God would lead us to the UK. So that's been something that's been in our hearts for a number of years already. Some of our friends, we would have shared that with, some people we've journeyed with, but it never felt current, it never felt soon. It always felt like it would be something when our kids were out of the home. And I think it's really important that we share right up front in this video that we're processing now, looking back, knowing what God has said about the UK and feeling like a certainty in our hearts that He's called us, but it really hasn't felt like that, hey babe?
Yeah, no, definitely. It's never been, I always think like if somebody had given me 7 one-way tickets to the UK, I would never have chosen it. So the longing and the reality were very on different paths. So I think that's the best way I can describe it. Essentially, just to say it's not clean, it's not clear cut. Yeah. It can feel quite messy sometimes. Yeah, and that we want to say that because we want to inspire faith in the journey that God has you on, and what He's wanting to call you to. That it's very easy to listen to our story today and think, oh, it's so clear. God spoke so clearly. All of us would have gone. Actually, in the moments, it felt really unclear, really discombobulating, confusing. Add in other synonyms. So with that as our backdrop, in terms of where we processed or had the UK in terms of our future plans or within our marriage and who we are as people, about a year ago, Paul told me about an experience shortly after it happened that he had at Tuesday Think Night, where they were watching a video about a video,
church history.
I'm just saying video, I'm a bit old. Yeah. Do we call them videos anymore?
I don't know. Something on a screen.
Where they were talking about missionaries who'd gone out from the UK and Europe in the Reformation age to the rest of the world and had spread the gospel. And there was a moment in there where the guy presenting had asked, who's going to come back to the UK and re-evangelize the UK? What with it being a kind of, it's a secular society now. And so Paul had come back and had really had really struggled to sleep, which, if you know Paul, is a big thing.
Yeah.
So he had struggled to sleep that night, feeling like the Lord was asking him, do you trust me with your children? Would you trust me if I'd called you to the UK? And obviously Paul was like, well, I know the right answer, but no, I don't trust you. And I couldn't sleep until he felt that he could honestly answer that.
Well, that's actually
yes.
not quite accurate. I actually went to sleep resting with the Lord, saying, I don't think I can. And it was actually only the next morning that I was able to say to the Lord, I know you're a better father.
Okay.
I know you care for my kids better than Kate and I ever could. And so I do trust you. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was a big moment, but because he felt like he'd got the right answer, and it felt like the pressure had gone off after that. Hey? So when he told me, it was like, I've passed, I had this strange experience, it was good, and I feel like I've passed the test. So, you know, doors open to stay in Stellenbosch.
Yeah, and so fast forward a little bit, and we had a sabbatical last year, and as part of that, I was able to go on a 12-day retreat with some pastors and ministry leaders, and it was quite a shaped retreat, and there were 4 couples who've been doing it for many years. They were all in their 70s or 80s, and they led us for this 12 days. And I didn't know at the time, but they actually have such a big network of people around the world who were praying for us by name and our family for 2 weeks before we went on this retreat. It was an amazing experience. And on that retreat, on 2 evenings when I was asleep, I had dreams, and it's never happened to me before. I haven't had one since. And both of the dreams were, I woke up the next morning and I knew that God, it was just a sense of God had spoken to me. Both of them were Kate and I in the dreams, and they were around fear. And one was around people trying to hurt us. The other was around a wild beast trying to hurt us. And in both of them, the fears were unfounded. And I woke up with a great sense of relief that God was for us and we didn't need to fear. And the amazing thing is I phoned Kate after the second dream and said, you won't believe this is the dream I had last night. And Kate had an almost identical dream around our children, also with a wild beast. And it was amazing, just this
wild beasts. We're going to have to say goodbye to wild beasts.
Wild beasts.
They've got daddy long legs in the UK.
On the same night, Kate had these same dreams. And so this kind of like the theme of this 12-day time that I was away was fear. People kept on speaking into fear. Yeah. And I was wondering it was just fear of my own heart and the terrain. And
I think you also thought it was probably for me, hey, because I'm generally the more fearful of the two of us. Paul does not experience fear.
In that way very often.
Kind of by personality.
It was just unusual. Yeah. It was really unusual. And the key text was out of Psalm 46 that someone brought for us on the sabbatical. And this, you'll see later on why this becomes so pivotal to our story. At the time, we weren't thinking about the UK. None of this felt like it was around the UK. It just felt like God was dealing with us and our hearts and our marriage and all of these things. But the verses, or the psalm is, God is our refuge and strength, always ready to help in times of trouble. So we will not fear when earthquakes come and the mountains crumble into the sea. Let the oceans roar and foam. Let the mountains tremble as the waters surge. And this idea that as everything is falling into the ocean and earthquakes are happening and et cetera, that God is in control. And then the last kind of pivotal moment on that sabbatical retreat was one of the older men. He was 80-ish or so. Just said he had a picture that he felt God had for us. And the picture was of a hermit crab, and he asked me if I knew about hermit crabs, and I said I didn't. And he said that a hermit crab doesn't actually grow its shell. It has a shell, and when it gets too large for that shell, it has a very vulnerable moment where it runs across the seabed looking for another shell, an empty larger shell that it could fit into. And that was just his picture of how God was going to lead us into some kind of season where there'd be vulnerability, again, where there'd be fear or danger or peril, this kind of crossing the ocean floor. And again, we'll come back to that a little later in terms of why that feels so important.
Okay, so given the context that we are sharing all this in, i.e. a call to the UK, and the fact that the Lord was speaking to us about fear, and so we didn't know this at the time, you know, that the fear was around going to the UK. But I think it's important that we say what our fears are, because, you know, I mean, obviously coming from the UK and knowing lots of people in the UK, like, it's not a very scary country in many ways, and there's lots of us who would on many levels want to go there. So it's not this big scary place that we're going to, except there are aspects that are quite frightening. So can you tell us, like, what are your biggest fears?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, growing up South African, especially my age South African, I think we've just seen so many people immigrate, so many people go to the kind of land of milk and honey and go make money and come back later on maybe, or maybe, you know, Australia, New Zealand, England, all of these places. And it just feels like God deep dived in a year ago straight onto the biggest kind of fear in my heart has been around secularization, our children, some of the agendas that the Western world is really pushing out pretty aggressively into our kids, trying to, in my view, brainwash children into ideologies and ways of thinking. And that, for me, since as long as I can remember, has always been far more relevant and scary than kind of any of the corruption or crime or roads not being fixed in South Africa or whatever it might be, Eskom. Those things for me have always been things that you can work around quite easily. And yes, they're inconvenient, and yes, they're a bother, but they feel very much like things you can put up an electric fence, you can put up solar, you can protect yourselves from them. Whereas the kind of ideologies and things around our kids terrify me, because they feel so insidious, they feel so subversive and underground, and that they can get into our kids. And so the biggest prayer in my heart over this period has been, God, protect our children. I don't think I'd be feeling afraid at all going into the UK if our kids were serving Jesus and were 18 and older. That's not our responsibility anymore. But for parents and for me as a dad, feeling like I'm making a decision to take my children into a place where God is not valued in the same way, community is not guaranteed in the same way that any kind of town we go to, we could find a gospel-centered, life-giving community for our children, has felt really scary. And then obviously just the natural fears, like we don't know what God's called us to. We don't have anyone on that side saying, hey, come and work here or do this. And so to think about handing over One Hope and everything we have, and leaving our home and leaving a place that we love, a country that we love, and you just have to pull all of these levers at once, but without any sense of certainty on the other side, financial, location, geographic, vocational work. Like these are big scary things that I've had to take to God personally as a dad and a husband, again and again, and just make sure, very, very, very sure that this is God, and not some bad cheese that I ate that gave me a strange dream one time, you know. And again, just love to, what from a mom's heart, what are you obviously, like you say, not so scared of England or the UK,
I think I grew up there and was a Christian there, and I think being able to give my children a different experience has been really great. I think as a teen there, with new faith, it was very difficult. It added an extra layer of weight to be in a really small minority. And I remember going to a youth group or a youth meeting and having one of the youth leaders saying, look, statistically, 1 in 7 of you will be serving Jesus in 20 years' time. Sure. And at the time I was there, I happened to be there in a group of 7, and I looked around and I was like, no way, we're all going to serve Jesus. Well, 20 years on, I'm the only one serving Jesus. And those things are big. You want what you have found, the pearl of great price that you have found, you obviously want your children to experience. And the idea that they would be in a context where that could be snatched from them is the actually only fear. I mean, obviously I'm afraid that we're not going to have any money and we're going to, be destitute. There are moments of those fears, but they are nothing in comparison to feeling like we've had this opportunity to give our children like a really soft, cushy soil where they're not in the drastic minority, and that they do have room for spiritual growth, and that spiritual growth is celebrated, not like actively pushed away. So for me, that is really the only fear worth mentioning, to be honest.
Yeah. And I mean, just speaking into your story of whatever God is going to lead you into, and those things, we've had hundreds of moments where it feels like God's asked us to obey Him in much smaller ones. This is definitely for us the biggest one. We've moved from the UK to South Africa, but we were just a newly married couple. Didn't feel very risky. Felt full of faith at the time, but just this for us it was. But this is a far bigger thing, and I just want to point to something in the story of the kindness of God, and how God was beginning to prepare our hearts for years beforehand, but then even more explicitly beginning to deal with these things before we were feeling them. We weren't feeling afraid of the UK on sabbatical, or that we were about to make an imminent move. Quite the opposite. We came back, and I remember sitting with Johannes on the first kind of debrief coffee after 3 months coming back, sitting down at Yaya's, and just saying like we feel like we can commit our hearts here for the next season, and just we're excited. to be leading One Hope and to be in Stellenbosch, and we just feel really settled. And it was right into that moment that God spoke. But looking back, God had been so kindly and gently and graciously preparing us with word after word after word, that at the time it still to me feels like there were dual things that God was doing. I think God was really speaking to us just personally about our own hearts and our own fears to engage with emotional things.
Personal.
But then looking back, we see as well, wow, God, you were actually preparing us very gently and very thoroughly before this thing even really became a reality. And so I went to the UK in October of 2022, and Kate, I think at that stage you were, maybe just share some of what you were feeling as I went already.
I think it was Paul, it was just a regular trip. It was exciting that he was going to go to the UK. I think you were going to see some of my family. So I was feeling, I was living vicariously. And it was a lovely, exciting trip. And then when Paul had left, I just felt there were a number of nights when I was praying, and I felt like the Lord was preparing my heart for change. And it's easy to dismiss these things, because like lots of the things that come and I feel like maybe are from God turn out not to be. And so you hold these things lightly, and I held it lightly. But the thing is, there was another aspect, which was there were a few things which are sort of almost too arbitrary to mention, but just to reassure you that sometimes there are really arbitrary things that God uses that are so personal to you, but they form like little pixels in your story. But one of the bigger pixels was that we'd moved into the manse, the church house, a couple of years ago, but it came out, I think, a few months into our being here, that both Paul and I had this feeling that it wasn't permanent. And I had been so excited. That it wasn't ours. That I think I'd been so excited about living in a property that wasn't owned by somebody who was going to hike the rent or say, sorry, I'm moving back in 2 months, kind of thing. Just having some of the security that came with a property that was owned by the church, and unless we really stuffed up, we wouldn't get kicked out. And so this feeling that it wasn't going to be for a long time was quite uncomfortable. So those kind of two things were coexisting as a backdrop, but they had no real substance.
Yeah, and these kind of things, again, just how we hear God, each of us in our own journeys, they don't feel like much in the moment, or you don't want to put weight on them in the moment. You don't like have that little sense in your heart. I think we actually just on a date, and I remember walking back down Marina Road, and I think we had some coffees, and we were just talking.
God bless Vida.
And I think Kate said to me, I have this weird feeling that this house is not ours. And I'd been having the same feeling for weeks. I think I was still very embroiled in the renovations, and feeling like it was a lot of hard work and doing quite a lot of it myself, like the physical work, and actually feeling like, man, I'm doing all this work, but it feels like it's in a home that's not going to be ours for the long term. And as Kate said that, and I kind of reflected it back to her, we kind of had this moment, but it didn't go any further than that. It didn't feel like, okay, well, that's confirmation of some big change coming. It just was a little moment that only really looking back, we thought, oh, God was actually doing a little something there. So we need to move on for sake of time, but October, I fly over to the UK, and just feeling so settled in One Hope, so settled in our call, and we'd even made some kind of financial provision in the background to be able to keep Kate at home for the next season. And it was just all lining up. Had meetings with financial planners. It was all very much in process for the next decade.
For our plan.
Yeah. Exactly.
We've made a good plan.
So I went over to the UK feeling absolutely relaxed around, man, I can just serve my heart out. You know, sometimes you go into a country and you can feel a little bit like, oh, is God calling us? And just going in feeling like, man, I'm so glad that's settled. I can just focus and give attention to the people I'm with and just love on them. And I think it was day 3 or 4. I was with a couple called Ben and Lo, in the Rhondda, which is in Wales. It's these valleys in Wales, and they just took us to this random coffee shop. They actually took us to show us their new home, which they were just busy building because they're moving town to plant a church. And while we were there, they took us to a little coffee shop, and Ben showed us on the wall this picture of these 2 valleys. There's 30 or 60, I forget the number, towns running up these 2 valleys, and he just simply said there's only 2 gospel-centered churches that he knows of in these 2 valleys, serving all of these towns. And in that moment, it just felt like the Holy Spirit deeply gripped my heart. And probably the most efficient thing, I'm just going to grab my journal and actually just read a little bit of what I wrote over that time, because there was a number of different words that came, or things that happened, and it's probably just going to be really efficient just to read them. And I wrote, I suddenly felt a completely unexpected and overwhelming rush of emotion as I looked at the rows of houses and was reminded of Jesus's words in Matthew 9, where he says he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And this was my experience of being in the UK. And obviously there's many wonderful churches and many wonderful things that God is doing, but in a secular society, people are grasping for things, and they just such a wonderful description. They were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd, or like someone in an ocean drowning and reaching out, but there's not really anything they can get their hands on. And then he said to his disciples, this is Matthew again, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. And then carrying on reading, I couldn't stop the tears flowing as I thought of so many perishing without Christ. I stood there awkwardly, trying not to show my emotion as Ben and Arno graciously walked back to get coffee. It took me many minutes to regain my composure as I felt the Holy Spirit working in some deep part of my heart. And again, standing there, not phoning Kate and saying, I think we called to the UK, just feeling like God's stirring my heart. The second thing I wrote was at that same picture of the 2 valleys, asking me how it could be right that South Africa has so many churches where the gospel can be heard, where disciples can be made, and people's lives eternally changed, while simultaneously millions in other countries perish for lack of knowledge, with just a handful of gospel-believing churches in so many towns and villages. And this verse of Romans 10 was beating in my heart. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they've never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach, that would be us in this context, unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. But they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what he has heard for us? So faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. And so standing there and feeling these things at this picture, and then at the same time, just a caution here or a clarification, there's no part of us which feels that having lots of churches in one town is a bad thing. That's a wonderful thing. It's a gospel grace thing. I think it's just for us personally in that moment, God began to speak to us about changing what we would do or what we should do with the time that he's given us in this life and the ministry that he wants us to do. And it was a changing of season for us rather than some kind of changing of season for the way we do church around the world, if that makes sense. There was another picture in another church in Wales, a little place called Barry, just below Cardiff. And I was worshipping there. It's a brand new church plant. There's about 20 people or so at the time. And I'll read here, the Holy Spirit reminded me of Jesus' teaching that he leaves the 99 who are already his sheep to search for the one who is not. Deep down, a resolution or a stirring beginning to be like Christ in this regard. And the text is Matthew 18, where Jesus says, if a man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountain and go in search of the one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than the 99 that never went astray. There's quite a few here, I know, but I do want to just give you some of how God has spoken to us, and in this case it was more specifically to me, and then Kate has looked back on that and felt part of the journey.
Well, I think for me it's just been a much longer journey. Like there's been always a massive desire to go and tell, like to go and share my experience with my people. You know, these are my friends, my family, my country that I grew up in, that gave me so much and that has historically given so much to the rest of the world in terms of the gospel. So it specifically, yes, I think he was speaking to you in this, but it was in confirmation, or it was bringing in that thread that's been running through me, through my life.
Yes, some of the stuff feels a little bit like God draws lines. Yeah. Sometimes as a couple, sometimes with just one person. Yeah. And then he kind of colours in the picture a little more.
It feels very much like our story.
Yeah. On a train, this is the fourth thing I wrote, on a train leaving Cardiff and seeing down the aisle for carriages on end, people on phones, distracted and lost, and having a sick sense of the Holy Spirit impress on me that it was as if this train was headed to take all of these people to hell, to be forever without God. And then seeing in my mind the whole of these countries and islands surrounding Britain with thousands of trains heading similarly to this destination, laden with ignorant and even unafraid travelers, unaware, but for the love of Christ, which produces station after station for opportunity to disembark. And I actually on that train took a photo and just of people, if any of you have been on these kind of UK trains, you know, no one wants to talk. Everyone just is completely personally...
Unless you're Paul, in which case, even on the
or you're South African and then you chat
you'll say hello
with people. It's just rude not to say hi if you see someone, right?
Oh, but it's awkward being with you.
Yeah, Kate's not her favourite
Okay,
moment.
another fear.
So,
sorry.
But taking a picture of these people just completely distracted, and the sense of the Holy Spirit, pressing strongly on my heart how the devil would keep them in this state of not knowing anything about God, just distracted with their lives, carrying on, completely unaware that actually the journey that they're on, the life that they're on, unless someone comes and helps or tells them, or they walk into a church or do an alpha or meet someone at a school that can share the love of Jesus with them, that they will just continue in ignorance completely unaware, straight into the purposes and the plans of the devil, into an eternity without God. And then finally, and these two will link very strongly, these two pictures have become quite strong pillars, I think, for us, because they just confirm so much of what we feel God had spoken to us up to this point, and really brought into focus for us what God had been saying, and made us realize, oh, we think this is God calling us to the UK. And so the morning I was in Northern Ireland, I preached in the morning, and after the service, a young man came up to me. His name is Maxim. He is on the eldership track in a church in Belfast, and he asked me if he could share 2 pictures that he felt God had given him. I think it was the night before that he'd been praying or something like that, and I asked if I could record it. So these are actually verbatim exactly what he said to me in that moment. He said, "I saw a herd of buffalo, and they were in a plain, but they were in a spot where there were trees or bushes, and they were safe. But there was one who was looking ahead to the plains, and knowing that it had to go, but just too afraid to go, like there was something hiding there, lions or something. There was a peril, a danger, and the rest of the buffalo were behind this one and waiting just to see if they could also go or not." And then he had a second picture of a huge cliff and a very abrupt sea at the bottom, and there was a town at the top of the cliff, and off the cliff you could see parts of it, just huge rocks falling into the sea and loads of waves just going everywhere. It was all just breaking down around the town, and you thought that the town was just going to fall in as well as the sea, but it just didn't. Everything was breaking around it, but the town was still intact. And as we reflected on that, and I think on Sunday a few weeks ago, I shared about writing. This was actually the document that I'm reading to you now, was the document that I began writing on the plane coming home, and that hadn't spoken to Kate yet in the journey, and just a real overwhelming sense of, oh my goodness, this is God. And part of that was, I don't know if you spotted the incredible similarities to how God was speaking to us on our sabbatical, and in particular these last 2 pictures where Psalm 46 was this key verse on our sabbatical, and God was speaking to us about fear, 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 and the dreams I had were around fear, and the experience I had at Tuesday Think Night a year before had been about fear, and all of these things. And then God brings this guy I've never met, and it brings these words which for our family have become so precious in this journey, where the one is about all these mountains or these cliffs falling into the ocean, and it's exactly it's like basically a picture of Psalm 46, but except for this fact that there's this little town on the edge, which for us has had incredible precious meaning around our family and around God sustaining us, but also God sustaining those that He's going to join to us. And it's more than us, it's a bigger picture of a town, and how God's going to hold us in the midst of this thing. And that psalm starts off with, God is our refuge and strength in times of trouble. And so that picture has been so precious. And then the other one around the buffalo, just as much around needing to cross this plain. And immediately it felt like the Holy Spirit linked these pictures for me to the picture of the hermit crab and this vulnerability. And literally the wording that this Maxim guy was saying was that this buffalo senses that there's danger or that there's peril, lions or something is the way he said it, and needing to cross or needing to do something, but that as we do that, there's other buffalo watching and kind of finding faith for themselves in the faith that God has given us for the journey that we have ahead of us. And so that's some of the detail.
There's so much more.
And
it's very cool.
Some of it just feels so precious as well, and just really sacred. And then I think maybe we should just finish off just talking to some of the process and some of how we've then thinking as a couple, coming back, sharing with Kate, and beginning to process it as a couple, and how we did that, because that's a really, really important part of of hearing God, that we're not just in isolation, you know. So maybe you share just some of what that looked like in the last 6 months.
So obviously processing such a big decision, we didn't want to do it on our own without outside perspective. So we started off by chatting with Steph and Kaz, who have been obviously part of the One Hope story for a long time. They led New Gen Stellenbosch, which became One Hope, but they have also been part of our lives for like 15, 16 years. They've not been afraid in the past to tell us that they think that we're misguided. We knew that they would be honest, that they wouldn't just tell us that, no, that sounds great. So I think we went to them both feeling like, kind of hoping that they'd tell us that we're nuts and that they don't see it. But they didn't. They had some, it was just incredibly useful first conversation. We, after that first meeting, we committed to praying about it and to not getting too caught up in the details. We committed to like not looking for houses and, you know, not getting ahead of ourselves in those ways, but to rather like bring our hearts before God and really try and work out if this was Him. Beyond that, we couple of a month later, we went to Arno and Claire, who we've also got a relationship with more recently, but who know the UK context. Paul actually travelled with them when he went over in October. Or just also for good perspective across both contexts, and they know us well enough also to say, no, we think you're crazy and we don't think it's a good fit. But they didn't. And I think after that meeting, it gained enough traction for us to really start thinking, oh boy, like this is it. This is probably God. And so we sat on it over Christmas and into New Year, also just praying and keeping the circle small.
Time-wise, just a few little lost in the detail. We're at about end of December, would have been kind of 3 months into processing already. 2 months,
but and yes, and then after Christmas feeling like, okay, now we have to share it with our elders, and then that became extremely hard for me. That's where the tears began. We first told Ali and Johannes, and I was really willing them. I thought they were our best bet at saying no way, but you let us down, guys. And they said, we don't. You know, it's sad, but it feels right. And so each of these, I want to say nails in the coffin, but I think that's probably a bit negative. But at the time, it felt a bit like nails in the coffin in terms of leaving Stellenbosch.
I think the part that we really want to get across here, more so than this is exactly who we saw when, is
and we saw them
a little more, don't process alone.
Yeah.
These things are, if God is speaking, be confident that others will hear Him too.
Yeah.
Be confident that you can bring what you feel God is saying and have others pray with you, and that if God is saying that, God will still be saying it at the end of the process. I think that's one really key thing. And the other really key thing, and obviously as church leaders we see this a whole lot, is that people come already having made up their minds, and that's just so unhelpful, because they're just asking you to rubber stamp something, and so you've got to be early enough in the process and in the thinking, and secure enough in God actually saying it, that you let people in on the process where they're still able to say to you, I really don't think this is God, or have you considered this, and push back on your process. And so that for us, this journey was really slow and really beautiful in working some of that out and being like open-handed, and even like Kate saying, hoping a little bit like that we're not hearing God. But also, I think both of us have had a very sneaky suspicion right the way through the whole thing that God was speaking, and we were just struggling to process really what He was saying.
Yeah. I think the moral of the story for me is essentially that when you're listening for the call of God, number one, you can be sure that if he's calling you, he will persist. But number two, it feels really messy, like in the moment. In hindsight, it's all wonderful. Well, I mean, even in hindsight, it can appear sketchy, but in hindsight, it's much easier to interpret. And a lot of the ways that he speaks to us are almost a way of looking back and saying, oh yes, he was in that, rather than in the moment feeling, confirming, rather than instructive. But just that it can be messy, but if you can, try and enjoy the ride. I think a lot of people especially since we told everybody, the thing that people have said to me the most often has been like, just relax into the process. And I think as much as I've not mastered that, that is definitely something that I would like to master, and especially want to pass on now in terms of discovering your own call. Yeah.
Last verse, because I'm a preacher, Philippians 4,
the last word.
Verse 6, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your mind in Christ Jesus. And I think Paul, writing here to the Philippians, is making a case that there really is stuff to be anxious about. There really are things that when you employ your own human understanding to them and you put logic on them or whatever it may be, they do bring concern, they do bring anxiety, they do bring fears. And he's really saying that into that very moment, God will press his peace. And I think this is a huge sign of God speaking. Not that just you feel peaceful about something, but that you feel peaceful about things which you have no business feeling peace about. And so in our story, watching Kate, and just a moment to celebrate her in our journey, and watching how there's huge things on the table. I might have a more natural faith toward financial things, for example, or stuff like that. And then Kate, I think in reverse, I'm nervous around living in the UK, small homes, the weather, not having my grass. If any of you know me well, you know how much I love my lawn. And these silly little things, and not such silly things, actually, they're big things. And in those moments, feeling like our logic says that we should be flipping out, and yet God is giving Kate and me, a supernatural peace. And that's, again, one of just the hallmarks of... I
think it's also important to know that he's also giving that peace to the kids. I mean, if we spoke to you about our kids' experience of all of this, the video would be... Video again? What do we call it?
I don't know.
The presentation would be even longer, like way longer. I just want to assure anyone who's worried that the kids are feeling the peace and the excitement as well.
Awesome. And so as you think about what God's calling you to, and the faith steps that he's calling you to, however little they may seem or big they may seem, we want to encourage you to listen carefully, listen long, listen with people around you, listen prayerfully, keep going back to God again.
As well.
Again, that's great. Listen with excitement, be encouraged that God is a speaking God and he intends to speak to his people. And I hope we love you so much, and hope that this little story of ours is really helpful for you.
I'm glad you're not physically here, because otherwise I literally would be in tears.